Quirk Factor by GardenOfManEatingPlants. Summary. The bullets messed with the quirk factor. Izuku had a fleeting thought, and he latched onto it. One so rash and reckless, even he would normally cringe back at the thought. But he didn't have time to think things through. Togata was on the line. Him and his quirk and his dreams. He had to do something. Time restarted, and Izuku jumped in front of the bullet. Or, what if Izuku arrived at the fight with Overhaul just a little earlier? Notes. This is for a mini-event on the No Writing Academia server called Scene Twist, where we take a canon scene and write a different version of it. I'm going to do more of these because fuck canon, my town now. Rushing through the hall with full cowl activated, Izuku gnawed on his lip, stomach doing flips. Togata had been alone with Chisaki for several minutes now, and who knew what state he was in. He had to divert half his attention to protecting Eri too, and Izuku knew personally how hard it was to fight while worrying about a little kid you didn't want to get caught in the crossfire. Kota had been so small, so terrified, all tiny arms and shaky legs and tears and false bravado. And what a monster Muscular had to be to hurt such a small child for the fun of it. He doesn't want to think about the impact as he was thrown against the trees, his broken arms, the way he shattered them just to defeat that monster. He knew how hard it was to protect someone and fend off your attacker at once. The thought of Togata having to face those same circumstances soured his gut. His upperclassmen may have been older, but nobody should have to face things like that. Not before they even graduate. There was a wall ahead, metal-looking and looming, but he could hear voices through it. Yelling, cursing, and most importantly, one of those voices sounded like his friend. Izuku geared up a leg, upping the percentage of one for all almost subconsciously. If the wall was thin enough to hear voices through, it was thin enough to break with about maybe 8% of one for all. That may have been overkill, but he'd rather not take any chances and alert Overhaul and his underlings to his presence. They could do something rash in the time it took to break through the wall after his failed first attempt. He smashed through the wall, flying toward the scene of the fight and skidding to a stop at the mere sight of it. It almost seemed like the world slowed for a moment, pausing this horrid image just long enough for him to sear it into his brain, see it when he closed his eyes. A strangled no slipped out of him. Overhaul was standing, regal and tall, and not at all like the monster he was, pointing a commanding finger at Eri's small, hunched-over form. His underling with the silver, arrow-shaped hair had a gun pointed at her. Izuku couldn't tell for sure, but he knew deep in his heart it was loaded. They didn't have to worry about killing her after all, not when they could put her back together. And Togata was there, a look in his eyes that Izuku knew all too well. He'd seen it in the mirror, in All Might's sunken but intense eyes, even in his classmates occasionally. His friend's feet were moving before he could think. Togata was going to jump in front of the bullet. The villain's ploy was obvious if you had a second to think about it. Pretend to prepare to hurt the hostage and get the hero to jump in and get hurt instead. Quick, easy, and not hard to figure out. But Togata didn't have a second to think, and, deep in Izuku's mind, he knew his senpai wouldn't care either way. He'd heard whispers of bullets that could erase your quirk permanently, that once you were shot, it messed with your quirk factor so irreparably you could never work your quirk again. Many heroes had already been hit by the temporary ones, and they were 100% effective. They worked on every hero they hit, and Izuku had to assume they would work on Togata. They messed with the quirk factor. Izuku had a fleeting thought, and he latched onto it, one so rash and reckless, even he would normally cringe back at the thought. But he didn't have time to think things through. Togata was on the line, him and his quirk and his dreams. He had to do something. Time restarted, and Izuku jumped in front of the bullet. The scene was still as the dust settled. Togata let out a strangled gasp, eyes burning a hole in the bullet wound he now sported. "Midoriya-kun," he breathed. "Oh no." Izuku ignored him for the time being. He flexed his arm once, twice, 3 times, and he shrugged. If he could keep fighting with 2 shattered arms, he could keep fighting with a measly shot to the bicep. His pain tolerance wasn't the best scale, the back of his mind reminded him. He ignored that too. Chisaki stared at him, first in shock, then in unmitigated glee. Overhaul began to laugh. Little hero jumped in front of the bullet. Now your quirk is gone. You weren't the one I was aiming for, but this is fine. You were too much of a threat to go unimpeded anyways. Monologuing gets kind of old eventually, especially when you've been attacked by villains so often. It gets easy to predict what they're going to say after a point. Izuku used the reprieve to zone most of the way out, ripping a strip of cloth off his already torn hero suit and tying it around his bullet wound in a makeshift tourniquet. The pressure on his wound hurt, but it was nothing unbearable. Finished, he tuned the rest of his brain back in on Chisaki, just in time to hear him say his last words. And now you're useless in the fight! Oh, that made him furious. Useless, Deku, they jeered. Can't even be useful in a fight except as a punching bag. Lightning crackled around him, starting off jerky and growing larger and larger until he was almost engulfed in the light. His quirk went from green to blue-green to bluish in seconds, the color change surprising him in the back of his laser-focused mind. Overhaul's eyes grow wide, bigger and bigger at the same rate his quirk grows. Sweat dripped down his brow. What? How is this happening? I got rid of your quirk. The bullets are permanent. Izuku grinned. Mirio was kind of in shock. Realistically speaking, that was kind of an understatement. The understatement of the century, to be exact. He'd gone from fighting villains while protecting a traumatized little girl, to getting ready to take a bullet to protect that little girl, to having sweet little Midoriya-kun take a bullet for him. And now, he stood there, shielding that little girl from debris and falling rocks, as Midoriya-kun somehow still managed to use his quirk and had decided to fight Chisaki while still bleeding from his gunshot wound like some type of avenging angel. And boy did he look like an avenging angel. His hair flying everywhere in some invisible wind that affected only him. Lightning wreathed his body with light that looked almost ethereal, and the grin he had on his face was more than a little feral. Mirio would almost worry that Midoriya was scaring little Eri, if not for the odd expression on her face as she looked upon the one-sided beatdown that was his Kohai, fighting one of the most frightening villains still enjoying freedom at the moment. "How are you still fighting?" Overhaul screamed. Midoriya-kun's eyes crinkled at the edges. If Mirio didn't know better, he'd say his Kohai was having fun. You can't destroy the quirk when it's not connected to the quirk factor, now can you? What did that even mean? Was the blood loss getting to Midoriya or something? Mirio shook his head. Focus. Chisaki being occupied for the moment gave him ample opportunity to get Eri away from him. He couldn't just sit there and gape like a civilian. He had work to do. He grabbed his strewn-about cape and wrapped it around her shoulders as tight as comfortable. Hoisting her onto his back, he set out for the hole in the wall Midoriya came crashing in through. The fight was clearly being taken care of, and Mirio knew how to prioritize. He'd wonder about Midoriya's bullshit quirk later. He had a little girl to get to safety. Overhaul scrambled back on his hands and knees, trying his hardest to get away from Izuku. "How did you do it?" he kept repeating. He was almost like a broken record at that point. Izuku didn't think this would startle him that bad, but he certainly wasn't complaining. Maybe he was so confident in his creation that seeing it fail was like a slap to the face. Either way, if he was enjoying the look on his face a tad too much, well, nobody would know. He huffed. Overhaul was liable to realize his quirk still worked and he could actually attack Izuku soon. He needed to end this quickly. Breaking off a nearby stone spike, he bashed the villain over the head. Overhaul went limp, finally quiet. He grabbed his handcuffs from one of the many pockets of his hero suit, I maneuvered him so he couldn't touch anything with his hands and free himself if he woke up. Satisfied, Izuku dusted off his hands and turned his attention to his wounded arm, and heard a cough behind him. He froze, slowly turning his head to find a gobsmacked Sir Night-Eye, an exasperated Aizawa-sensei, and a shell-shocked Mirio. They could all see the bullet wound he was nursing, and the fact that he could very much, and had very recently, used his quirk, after being shot with a quirk-erasing bullet. Whoops! He probably had some explaining to do. Problem child! Aizawa groaned into his hands. Izuku broke out into hysterical giggles, waving a non-injured arm at the group. I promise I can explain? His teacher groaned even louder. Notes. I hope you enjoyed. This concludes the reading of Quirk Factor by GardenOfManEatingPlants. Read to you by Mystic Malady.